Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you from wherever you are and whenever you are. We are here with episode 9 of AR Chat. As always, I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts, Crystal Golightly and Stephen Dickens. Today, we are joined by Gerry Van Zandt. So, Gerry, you and I had never spoken before. We spent some time off camera getting to know one another this morning. I'd love to start today's conversation off with just a quick background. So, who are you? Where do you come from? Where have you been? Where are you at today? Please illuminate yourself for the audience.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. And I wanted to thank the three of you for inviting me and having me. I'm very humbled and very proud that, you guys had me on your show. So yeah, Gerry Van Zandt. I currently live in Annapolis, Maryland, home of the U.S. Naval Academy, just outside of Washington, D.C. However, I'm originally a Washington State native, grew up in the Seattle area, started my career, in the very early 90s, and began doing AR in 92, 93 timeframe. That in the context of doing PR and starting to engage with analysts. And I took my first full-time AR position in 97 when Intel was forming its first analyst relations team. And after a little bit of a detour in my Intel career into campaign marketing and brand management, I then pivoted back into analyst relations because that was truly what I discovered to be my first love. So went back in, started at HP in 2008, was at HP and AR 7.5 years, pivoted over to Oracle in 2015, was there 6 years as a member of a really wonderful AR team. And then 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, I decided I was ready to and really wanted to have run my own program. So I had an awesome opportunity at Alteryx, which is an analytics software company based in Southern California. I am a solo practitioner and just had a wonderful time, wonderful experience, creating and running my own program. It's just been a great experience. So a really fun and varied career in analyst relations, working for both big and small companies.
So, Gerry, I think we'll come back to the solo practitioner piece because I'm super interested in that. But I know Crystal's always got a great question. I think with your background, it's going to be really good to sort of take us back there. So over to you.
Yeah. Gerry, I think you're going to be able to get us closer and closer to who do you think was the first AR person, or you can weave in the story of how did this ecosystem even get started?
Yeah, I think that's the original AR person. I think that's one of the long lost mysteries of the universe, to be honest. I don't know. My supposition on this is that it was very likely that IBM and probably somebody in marketing or maybe even in sales who, began working with, for example, Gideon Gartner founded Gartner Group, back in the 1970s, early 1970s, because he was calculating residual mainframe values. So basically a company would buy a mainframe and they would sell it back to IBM or sell it, would go to another company. And so Gartner was calculating, the values of these and then advising customers on how to buy them and obviously, all of the software and ecosystem surrounding the mainframe environment. So I think it's very highly likely that this practice started at IBM, given Gartner's initial focus, on IBM. And certainly when I started my career, in the 1991, 92 timeframe, there definitely were AR people well established at that time. So I think this probably happened in the early to mid 1980s, where it was an organic thing with a few people and maybe at a few companies, and then this started spreading to other systems companies, digital equipment, HP, obviously IBM, and I think organically this field developed over time, and especially as Gartner began to spawn other analyst firms. For example, Meta Group, Dale Kutnick, who had been a Gartner, person, left Gartner, went out on his own, formed Meta Group, which then Gartner bought, I think in 2008. IDC was obviously founded in 1964. So I think these companies needed people to interface with these burgeoning, growing number of Yankee Group, some of these early analyst firms. Yankee Group was founded in the 1970s.
You don't hear Yankee Group anymore. I used to, back in the
Yankee,
day, see those guys, but that's a brand you don't see anymore.
which is now S&P.
But I think they've kept their 451 branding, right?
They keep the 451
Yeah.
branding, correct. I actually just had lunch last week with Nick Patience in London, who was one of the co-founders of 451. He's now over at Futurum, running their data and analytics practice. And, we talked a little bit about the history of 451, back in the day. And it was some very interesting experiences that Nick had relayed to me that I hadn't known.
To have on the show, Crystal.
Right.
We should get Nick.
I was just thinking, name drop number one, and interesting guest as we retrace and make our way through the ecosystem. Gerry, one question for you in what you just said is Beth Torrey, her session will release just a few before you. She actually has a guess that it's very likely Bill Hopkins. And I've actually talked about Bill in terms of the history of analyst relations. And he also thinks that he might be one of the first. Well, he might be a little bit more assured that he is, but he's also fuzzy a little bit. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to
Hands off
say. Yeah, it's really hard to say. As I think I put in a post on LinkedIn when I started. So actually, I worked in the 93, 94 timeframe. I consulted at HP in Cupertino, which is actually the site now of the Apple Flying Saucer headquarters building, but that used to be an HP site for decades. And I actually worked on that site. On site, 5 days a week, even though I was an agency contractor. My agency was in Santa Clara. And I shared a cube wall at HP with two of their AR. They had a team of AR people, 4 or 5 people. And there was a job share, 2 women, Sandy Leong, who is still doing AR actually today for HPE, and a woman named Brenda Opine. And so Sandy would work 2 days a week. Brenda would work 2 days a week. And they would both be in the office on Wednesday. I just remember sharing that cube wall. They were always on the phone with analysts and having conversations, and it just intrigued me. How, and this is back in like '93, and HP had a full-time AR team of a number of people, several people. Certainly by that time, the other companies outside of IBM were well entrenched with analyst relations. And then I pivoted on my agency role. I actually started work for IBM Storage Systems Division, which was based in South San Jose, and used to commute down there from Menlo Park, where I lived. So there was a woman, Carol Kessler, who is long retired, but she was a full-time analyst relations person for IBM Storage. So again, very, very well entrenched at that point. And then later on, I went to work. I consulted with SAP, and they had a woman, and this is in the 97, 96 timeframe, a woman named Jen Scholes, and she was the head of AR. I think she was the only AR person at SAP.
I think we hit the history jackpot with this session, right?
Yeah, well, this is definitely the Genesis story explained, isn't it, Crystal?
It is.
I think something interesting that Gerry's hitting on, and Gerry, tell me if I'm missing the mark completely, but you had agency experience in analyst relations in the early 90s. And that makes sense that PR agencies started to probably dabble in analyst relations early because of requests from clients who maybe didn't have the budget or the kind of viewpoint to have a full-time person on staff. In this case, they did, obviously. They had a couple partial, fractional people and full-time. But
yeah. Well, and it was interesting back in the day. You're right. I think I started doing AR very furtively, I would say. PR was my job, truly. I mean, it was 90% of my job. I started working with analysts, or I would get requests peeled off from the HP AR team to say, hey, could you handle this? And so it just kind of snowballed from there. But I'll give you one little anecdote that I love. And someday I'm going to write a book about, AR and my AR career. But at HP in Cupertino there, my cube was right across the aisle from another cube where they had office supplies, and they had 2 or 3 fax machines. Remember fax machines, right? Lined up. And every Friday afternoon, the fax machines would start lighting up about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I knew what this was because I would run over there. And so Gartner, they start spitting out, faxes from, one would be from Gartner, one would be from Meta Group. And they would call it the Gartner fax and the Meta fax. And what these were basically 2-page from each firm, 2-page paragraph summaries of the key news from the industry of the week, of the of the previous week. So it's just a little digest,
Oh
basically.
my
And I would
right?
run over to the copy machine, make copies, and I would just put them in my obviously give the originals to my colleagues, but I would take the copies home and digest them over the weekend, and that would be my weekend reading. But Gartner back in those days, and Meta and others, they would ship. This is before the internet, so Gartner would ship
Yeah.
packets of research notes, physical printed research notes in big fat envelopes to people, at HP. And then they had these big binders above their desks, and, they would do the notes and maybe photocopy them for others. But, they would put the notes in these big binders, and, you always knew an AR person's cube because they'd have like 10 binders from HP, or sorry, 10 binders from Gartner and 5 binders from Meta. And they'd have a bunch of IDC stuff, So, of course, those days are long gone, with the internet.
The first newsletter, basically.
I'd love if Gartner was enforcing.
You're only allowed to certainly distribute the facts to certain people, and we'll come and check.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And I think the internet was a real boon to these firms
That
in terms
model.
of enforcing. Yeah.
I want to take you back to something. This is fantastic, and we could spend a whole episode on this. And Crystal would love it because this is your specialist.
I know I love thinking about the past and how it informs the future. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I love it. But go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, but the story, I think this gives a fantastic setup, Gerry, to the question I want to ask you. You've worked for some of the biggest firms in the industry, on some of the biggest AR teams in the industry. But now you mentioned that you're at Alteryx and you're that solo practitioner. So I want to spend a few minutes there if we can.
Yeah,
what does that mean? What have you seen? What has been good? What has been bad? I speak to so many, and I call it the me, myself, and I model of analyst relations. I think when Sonia Vargas started the program at Databricks, I speak to so many Kim Dorsey who's at InterSystems. There's a whole bunch of people I know out there who do this job on their own. And part of the genesis of this podcast is to speak to those individuals because they haven't got a team. We're trying to provide some of that community sort of virtually via this podcast. So I'd love to just get your perspective, and maybe we spend a few minutes there because I think there's a lot to unpack on that individual kind of practitioner perspective. So if you could just freestyle like that, that's a long, rambling question. I think there's a question in there somewhere, but maybe just if you can give us a perspective, Gerry, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. So I have really enjoyed being a solo practitioner. I think being on larger teams prepared me well over the years in terms of many different aspects of being a solo practitioner. And what I mean by that is, in terms of the administrative tasks, managing contracts and negotiating contracts, managing purchase orders and purchase requests, and just kind of the drudgery of side of AR, right? Just the administrative side, but then obviously the relationship building side. And, it is really nice when you're on a larger team, having the resources and being able to hand off certain things, working with an events person to put on your analyst summit, for example, or having an analyst summit team of 6 or 7 people who collectively put on an event versus doing it all yourself. And, that is a completely different challenge. But I think what I learned collectively from those years of being on large teams, it gave me the experience and the knowledge and the ability to execute details, to do things on a more smaller solo basis. So it's been a fun experience. One thing I really love about being a solo practitioner or your own team is you really control your own destiny internally, with your stakeholders, with your executive team, with your colleagues in marketing, your colleagues in communications and PR, and so I feel like you're, as a solo practitioner, there's a sense of importance, there's a sense of purpose that maybe you don't have part of a larger team because you're a cog in a larger, you're a cog in a larger machine versus you are the machine as a solo practitioner.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe a follow-up question. What are some of the challenges in that model, Gerry? Because there's nobody to rub up against. There's nobody to sort of collaborate with. There's no checks. There's no balances. Maybe that's the good thing about it because, as you said, you get to control your own destiny. But I think what we're trying to do on this podcast with Crystal and Nathan and myself is really kind of highlight what it means to be day to day. You know, you may be working on a team at a massive organization, but not know what independence look like because you only deal with Gartner. You might be not aware of what it means to be a solo practitioner. So maybe just you can expand a little bit on some of the guardrails and some of the things you need to be thinking about if you're a solo, because I think there's going to be a bunch of solo practitioners listening to this, and I think with your background, they'll find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think somewhere around 60% of all AR practitioners, give or take today, are solo practitioners. So
Wow, okay, is it that much?
yeah, it's actually an extremely common model.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of us out there. I think you mentioned, Stephen, collaboration. So obviously on a larger team, you're collaborating a lot more with your direct AR colleagues, and obviously, on a solo, you don't have that. But I would say as a solo practitioner, I'm more collaborative and more networked than I ever was in a larger team with more functions and more people. Sales. In fact, I'm just working with our sales team now, on some stuff. Obviously I'm connected directly to our CMO. I mean, we have a group, our CEO, so with a smaller company, you're just more matrixed in, I feel like. And I think that you can embrace that, or, you can be scared of it. But I think, I've learned to embrace it because, in a larger company, you're compartmentalized, right? This is your job. It's within this box, right? You're the, AR manager for this, or the AR leader for this function, versus at a small company, you're doing it all. And I think it requires a level of awareness and savviness in terms of the analyst environment and knowledge of working with specific analysts, to your advantage and to their advantage too. It's a two-way street. I have the way I've designed my program at Alteryx is, obviously we engage with the major firms, and that is a significant portion. But I get as much or more value, honestly, from boutiques and smaller firms than I do from the big firms. And so, taking advantage of that and leveraging that internally is a huge, huge part of my job.
It seems to be a trend line that we're seeing coming through a lot of these discussions. I'm obviously biased, but we're starting to see that trend line. I mean, Nathan, I know it's maybe a question for you, and you can riff off this with Gerry. You're a solo practitioner amongst a bigger team, is the way I think of your role. You're the kind of inner business unit but you're not a solo because there's other people who work for Ericsson. Is there something there that I should be pulling on as a thread?
You're kind of correct. So within the business area, it's my director and myself, but each of us oversees disparate product lines or separate product lines. So it is very much a solo practitioner model with collaboration at a portfolio level. And then Ericsson has a group function analyst relations team as well. But so that's the answer to your question. I would echo what Gerry just said. I find that I get as much, if not more, value from my relationships with, independent and boutique analysts, if you want to call them that, than I do with my big.
A good name, because it's either independent or boutique. And
we need a better name. We do need a better listening. Like, boutique feels dismissive because it's so much more than that. I think independent and analysts from smaller firms can do so much for your business. Obviously,
yeah.
To be a time and a place for Gartner, Forrester, and IDC. This will continue to be true probably until the heat death of the universe. But there's so many other things you can do to benefit the organization across silos when you lean on relationships with other analysts who specialize in maybe go-to-market advisory, or they specialize in content generation. Like, there are just so many things to consider.
Yeah. I actually, Crystal, I wanted to ask you, I'm going to turn this around real quickly. So, Crystal, you have worked for many years, obviously, in your AR Insights role, with teams, the largest teams, and many solo practitioners. I'm interested in your observations from your side on that question.
It's funny that you ask me this, because I wanted to ask you about prioritization from big teams to small teams, because I think because that's what I kind of observe is in the solo practitioner or the siloed AR practitioner within a bigger team. you have to be really thoughtful about what you're prioritizing and be just wickedly dialed in to your corporate objectives. I know that you need that in any part of an AR team, right? But when you have more people, you can take a broad list of priorities and segment and all kinds of things, which has its pluses and minuses too, right? Because the hows and the whats may not fully be all working in conjunction, I think. So in terms of small versus big AR, the one common thread that I've seen over 14 years is that I think we all agree that our embedded in product can be really beneficial, but when they don't have that overarching team strategy, I've seen that it gets really messy in the big teams. And I think it's because you have people not coordinating their efforts and maximizing their engagements. I know that it's really hard to take, 30 people who are most valuable at that point in your company's life cycle to be embedded in the business, but not having a single thread and a team mentality, I think really hurts AR teams, because I've seen that model go bad a number of times consistently. I don't think I've ever seen that particular model execute well for a long time.
I think that makes sense. That
Yeah.
makes sense to me.
Yep.
I mean, I've just come this week from Dell Technology World and spent pretty much the whole week, Monday through Thursday. We're recording this on a Friday with that team, really tight-knit team. You could tell that they were firing on all cylinders. Kudos to them on a great event. 46 analysts kind of out at that event. You could tell that they wouldn't have been able to pull that off without overall coordination and then kind of the team being able to sort of pull together the various individual briefings. So I think you're on to something there, Crystal, that we'll maybe have to sort of pull out as a thread as we go through this around team structure and what works. But Gerry, keen to get your view as a response to Crystal's comments there. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to pick up on what Crystal mentioned, and I think part of your original question, Stephen, is the ruthless prioritization. That is what I've really had to learn in this role as a solo practitioner, is obviously being well grounded in corporate objectives and all of that, but prioritizing the analyst related activities, outbound and inbound, in terms of what's going to benefit the business most and what's going to help achieve the objectives that we want to achieve. It's been probably the biggest learning for me, honestly, the biggest muscle that I've learned to develop over the past 4+ years is ruthless prioritization and not letting the basic balls slip, making sure contracts are being done on time and those kind of things. So there's always something.
I'm just going to ask, does that ruthless prioritization change depending on the season, so to speak? So depending on what you are trying to accomplish from a company level, whether that be a major product launch or you're kind of in a development cycle, does that change how you're going about prioritizing work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a constant evolution. So we just actually had our user conference last week in Las Vegas. I didn't physically attend, I had another engagement, but yeah, I mean, just the AR preparation for that, that was a big blip over recent weeks. Now that's gone. We're off and running on other things. It's been interesting this year for me. So Alteryx was always in, for example, one Gartner MQ, and for many years we were not in any Forrester Waves. We were not in IDC, didn't do any MarketScapes. We did participate in a number of smaller vendor evaluations, and for some reason this year it's absolutely exploded. Talking, Nathan, about prioritization, I think I've had 13 RFIs that I've done just this year so far. And fortunately, I've been able to leverage some AI tools and also leverage other RFIs that I've done, leverage, things that we've answered and pull those in. So it's enabled me to handle the workload, whereas 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to say that because we would have been doing each one of these on an individual basis. So this whole thing about, AI and AR, and Teresa, she's wonderful. I love her post about AI and AR, and she's presented several times at the Forrester AR Council about, the different AR tools that she uses. And she's just been an inspiration to so many of us in terms of developing our own AI muscles. And so it's been a real boon for us. And so getting back to my original point here is, so obviously RFIs and analyst evaluations have become a huge priority for me this year, just because for some reason the volume of them has exploded, probably double to triple what they were just a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, I have the tools to deal with that.
I'd love to ask you one question based on what you said before that. Would completely agree. AI is a force multiplier. It can absolutely reinvent your life and your program, at least in terms of efficiency. You said that, before this year, Alteryx was really only in one MQ, no other major evaluations at Forrester or IDC. I think a lot of the times, and I want to tie this directly to your life as an independent practitioner and get your advice to other vendors who might be listening to this who don't have AR programs. There is value in having analyst relations, even if there isn't a magic quadrant or a wave or a marketscape covering your space. I mean, what would be your advice to them? They only think that value comes from those reports. What should they be thinking about? Why should they embrace analyst relations even before there's a ranking report?
So I think it's been said many times, analyst relations is a long game. As companies grow, as markets mature and change, the analyst firms adapt based on customer input and their own taxonomy and observations of the market. Gartner is constantly, and other firms too, constantly creating new magic quadrants to address new markets, or evolving existing magic quadrants, maybe as they see a market evolving. You should always have analyst relations. You should always be having those conversations, because number one, you can influence the analysts, through through executive conversations to say, hey, this is where we're going. This is how we see the market evaluating. This is our strategy. And the analysts will know this, and then, potentially include you if they're evolving an evaluation focus. They might say, okay, yeah, this actually does now include this company that maybe we hadn't included in any evaluations before, because the markets change. So, and that can happen pretty quickly. That can happen in a year or two. So, honestly, especially with this whole AI, explosion, things are just changing on a monthly basis. So, it's never too early to start having those conversations, to start working with the analysts. I think it's been interesting getting back to the beginning of the conversation about, how AR started. It used to be relatively few companies did AR. And I think over the last 10 to 12 years, most companies now realize they have to do AR. They have to have relationships with the analyst, and how they do it is that's up for debate, and they do it in different ways, right? They might just assign a marketing person to do it, and that, is part of their job. Or they might hire, it's always a big milestone when a company hires their first full-time AR person. That means that they're taking this seriously. Yeah, I think every company, most all companies, even startups, even people with 20 employees, they're doing analyst relations. They didn't used to do that, 10,
But
20
Gerry,
years ago.
they can't afford not to, because the amount of waste that happens when you make the wrong decisions in product or go to market or brand, or just so many different things, right? We could talk about that
absolutely.
for hours as well. The value of the analyst relationship.
So, Gerry, you make some really great points, and I think this could be a 2-hour episode really easily, and because I've really enjoyed the conversation. We've not met before, but there's so many things to unpack, but we do have to try and keep this time bound. Maybe we'll get you back on the show. I'd certainly be up for that. I think we could do a history lesson show, Crystal, and then we could do the continuing thread around the solo practitioner. But Gerry, I think you're perfectly suited to answer this kind of last wrap-up question before Nathan takes us home. Where do you see this industry going? I think you've got a fantastic sort of story arc and a perspective for some of those early days. I think that informs your ability to sort of answer the question. Where are we going from here? What does the next 5-10 years look like?
Yeah, I think, obviously more and more companies are going to continue to do analyst relations from the vendor side. I think it's going to be very interesting on the analyst firm side. Certainly we all know Gartner is going to continue to grow and to be a major force, in the advisory side. I actually do think, in my conversation I mentioned with Nick Patience at Futurum last week, was also kind of contributed my latest viewpoint on this. I actually think there is going to be a new generation of firms. Futurum is one that has, really grown, and it's been very interesting to see their strategy of, how they've acquired a number of firms, they've grown organically, and I think the industry, the AR industry, it has been waiting for new advisory firms to grow and challenge Gartner, and nobody's really successfully done that. And so I think we're going to see the rise of some firms, and I think Futurum is at the leading edge of that wave of, HFS, Horses for Sources. Phil First's firm is another. They've been around. Phil's been around a long time, but he's grown his firm and has carved out a wonderful, strong niche. I don't even say niche. I mean, he's done some amazing things. So I think some of these firms are, on the leading edge of a renaissance in the future. And I think we're going to see more firms coming, both boutiques, independents, and some of these firms growing and maturing into larger firms.
I'm obviously biased. I agree with you 100%, Gerry. That's the reason my business got going in November. Yeah, I mean, not to make this an infomercial for me, but absolutely agree 100%.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with another name drop. Oh my gosh, why am my name Herbal Lopez?
Oh yeah.
Rockstar.
Fantastic. And she had actually said there's a new shingle out every day, and there is a growing number of independent analysts and she even brought up the Analyst T, some that go broad and some that go deep, and it is interesting time
We should have Maribel on the show. She is a rock star.
Powerhouse.
Yeah. And that actually prompts another thought perhaps for you guys for a future show, is the AR industry, right? 10, 15 years ago, there were no real AR agencies, right? There were PR agencies who were doing AR, and then you saw companies like Spotlight, develop organically and grow. And there's, again, a lot of solo or small practitioners out there. Robin Schaefer is another one.
Robin's great.
They are with the Winds as well, right? And they're fully integrated into our.
Yeah, so I think the rise of non-in-house AR is also something that's been very interesting to watch, and how that's evolved over the years. So just a suggestion.
So great.
I think all of that boils down to we're at an inflection point. We're at an inflection point in the analyst relations world. We're at an inflection point in the analyst world with so many different companies and independent practitioners doing their own thing, doing a new unique thing, taking their own unique view on something, a la GigaOM, looking at things from an engineering-led perspective. So all that's to say, we could talk for hours. We will talk for hours. I'm going to continue talking with you on LinkedIn after this, but I think it's probably time for us to say goodbye today. You've been listening to episode 9 of AR Chat. Gerry, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And for those of you listening, please, most importantly, don't forget to get involved in the comments. This conversation doesn't have to stop here. Like, subscribe, do all the things, and reach out with your suggestions. Until next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.